Christ candle is lit. A simple but powerful symbol of presence, of seeing things in a different light, and of being on a path that needs light for us to follow. And we walk the path of faith daily on land that is sacred, a place of gathering and a source of food and shelter and spiritual connection for many indigenous peoples of Turtle Island over many thousands of years. We're learning to respect the long history of stewardship and relationship with the land and its creatures that is shared among the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We have a long way to go, but we are working to learn how to live in right relations with them and with this land. About 5 centuries before the time of Jesus, someone wrote a book of wisdom in poetry. It's autobiographical. The author refers to themselves as the teacher. It reads a bit like Khalil Gibran's book, The Prophet. The teacher, we discover, is discouraged, disheartened. Why? Well, he's bothered by the fact that he, and it is a he, we're pretty sure, will die. He knows that no one lives forever and that life is short when compared with the eternity of the cosmos. Pointless, says the teacher. Everything is pointless. The Hebrew word chavel refers to a mist or vapor, as the steam from a boiling kettle lasts only for a moment and then disappears. So too humans and our efforts to secure advantage through wealth, pleasure, we soon discover that this is fleeting. The teacher laments that as much as he's toiled in life, it will be nothing when he dies. And the teacher was, we know, immensely wealthy. Teacher is looking for meaning in life. What is it that makes people, including him, happy? Perhaps pleasure is the key. Perhaps wealth. He's forced to conclude that it's all fleeting. And so centuries ago, with disarming honesty, someone tells the story of their life and the values of his society and asks questions that are immediate and relatable to this day. Our reading is selected verses from Ecclesiastes 1 and 2. Perfectly pointless, says the teacher. Perfectly pointless. Everything is pointless. I am the teacher. I was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my mind to investigate and explore by wisdom all that happens under heaven. It's an unhappy obsession that God has given to human beings. When I observed all that happens under the sun, I realized that everything is pointless, a chasing after wind. I hated the things I worked so hard for here under the sun, because I will have to leave them to someone who comes after me. And who knows whether that one will be wise or foolish. Either way, that person will have control of the results of all my hard work and wisdom here under the sun. That too is pointless. I then gave myself up to despair as I thought about all my laborious hard work under the sun, because sometimes those who have worked hard with wisdom, knowledge, and skill must leave the results of their hard work as a possession to those who haven't worked hard for it at all. This too is pointless. It's a terrible wrong. I mean, what do people get for all their hard work and struggles? All their days are pain, their work is aggravation. Even at night, their hearts don't find rest. This too is pointless. But then at the end of the biblical story, when we kind of hope that all life's questions and contradictions will be tied up neatly, in Revelation 21, people do not go up to heaven, as most people have been taught, but rather we read there that God comes down to earth to dwell with mortals. The New Jerusalem descends from heaven. And God makes a home among us. There's no prediction about the end of times, no punishment, but God comes to be the home of humanity, our belonging. The book of Revelation claims a new creation will come, one in which God speaks to us directly. See, I'm making all things new. Followers of Jesus are not called to escape into this new world, but rather to partner with God in ways that will allow the transformation of God to be experienced in this world. Words from Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the former heaven and the former earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne say, Look, God's dwelling is here with humankind. God will dwell with them and they will be God's peoples. God himself will be with them as their God. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more. There will be no mourning or crying or pain anymore. The former things have passed away. Then the one seated on the throne said, Look, I am making all things new. In these readings, we hear God's voice. God is still speaking. Thanks be to God. In her book, Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery and art of living, Krista Tippett, the longtime host of the podcast, you get a theme running through here, On Being, writes, there are pleasurable, primal, life-giving reasons we are rediscovering the power of personal story everywhere in media and culture. The art of conversation I'm describing here is related, but it's something subtly and directionally different, sharing our stories in the service of probing together who we are and who we want to be. To me, she continues, every great story opens into an equally galvanizing exchange that we can have together. So what? How does this change the way you see and live? How might it inform the way I see and live? I believe, she concludes, I believe we can push ourselves further and use words more powerfully and tell and make the story of our time anew. Wow. But how do we do that? And how do we as a community of faith, as followers of Jesus in 21st century urban Canada, tell our story in a way that is as powerful as that? How do we do that in the context of the kinds of gnawing questions at the heart of the story of the teacher in Ecclesiastes, asking profound questions of life 2,500 years ago and today, and in light of the apocalyptic hope of Revelation in the year 100 of our era, both of whose words shape us as people of faith? How? The Irish theologian John O'Donoghue, in a conversation with Krista Tippett just before he died, said, it often seems to me that a person believes that if they tell you their story, that that's who they are. And sometimes these stories are constructed of the most banal, secondhand psychological and spiritual cliche. And you look at a beautiful, interesting face telling a story that you know doesn't hold a candle to the life that's secretly in there. So what I think happens here, O'Donoghue says, just a bit, is that there's a reduction of identity to biography, and they're not the same thing. I think biography unfolds our identity and makes it visible and puts the mirror of it out there, but I think identity is a more complex thing. So I believe, this is me now, that it's important to pay attention and to work at how we tell the stories that are the narrative of who we are, that tell us most deeply about ourselves, our true selves, about our deepest values and beliefs and hope, and that tell the stories of the groups, the communities that we are a part of, like the ones gathered here this morning. And it takes time. It takes time to cultivate and tell those stories. Learning about the ways the stories we tell transform us, the tellers of those stories, is all a part of this. So let me share something of a story with you. Donald Davis is a professional storyteller and a retired United Methodist minister from the United States, who came to realize that his most important work is to help people find the stories of their lives that are most important to them. And he illustrates this work by telling a story that his father told him. His father only told the story once, and it was more than 70 years ago. His father's name was Joe, common name. And the family name Davis was just as common in the town where he grew up in North Carolina. In fact, there were 3 Joe Davises in town, and so they all had nicknames, so you could tell them apart. There was Joe the photographer. There was a farmer named Joe who always used his middle name, Joe Silas. And then there was Donald's father, who was the one-man loan department in the First National Bank, and his nickname was Banker Joe. Donald Davis was 13 years old when one day his mother dropped him off and left him at the bank with his dad so she could run errands. His dad had things to keep him busy for a few hours, and it was Joe Davis's day to lock up at the end of business. And so Joe and Donald went out. His father locked the door, and as they turned around, Pitt McCarroll across the street was just locking the door of McCarroll's furniture. Joe said, "Well, hello, Pitt. Have a good night." And McCarroll looked across at Joe Davis and said, "Well, Cripple Joe, you have a good night too." Don and his father got in the car, and the 13-year-old turned to his father and said, "I didn't like that." "Didn't like what?" his father said. "That he called you Cripple Joe. He's supposed to call you Banker Joe." His dad pulled the car over, turned off the key, and said, "Let me tell you a story." The beginning of the story I already knew, Donald now says, about how my father, the 8th of 13 children, was born in 1901 on a farm in the North Mountains of Haywood County, North Carolina. When he was 5 years old, Joe was out behind the barn watching his father and 2 older brothers cut and split cedar shingles to put a new roof on an outbuilding. He was fascinated watching all the tools for splitting and shaping, and especially a little axe that was very sharp so they could clean off the shingles with it. And Joe wanted to help badly, really badly, but they all kept saying, "You're only 5 years old, get out of the way, you'll get hurt." In a little while, Grandma called them all to come to dinner, and Joe's dad and 2 older brothers headed inside to eat, and Joe thought, "This is my chance. This is my chance." He went over and pulled the little axe out of the end of the log where it had been left, and he went around chopping everything in sight. In a minute or two, the call came again. Come to dinner, because little Joe hadn't come in yet. So he went back over to chop the little axe back into the log. He swung the axe, missed the log, the axe glanced off the edge, and the blade buried itself through his kneecap into the center of his leg. And that's where they found little Joe, on the ground, when they went to see why he still hadn't come to dinner. Joe's father called to Grandma, "Bring a clean bed sheet while I saddle the horse." They got him up on the horse, Joe's dad holding the 5-year-old in his arms. And they rode to the nearest county doctor, who looked at the leg and said, "I've never seen anything like this. I don't know what to do. I'll just have to take the leg off." Joe's dad got him back on the horse, and they rode 16 miles all the way to the nearest larger town. And they went to the train station and asked the train agent, "When's the next train coming and where does it go?" The next train coming was not going to Asheville, it was going west. But you could go there, get a carriage across town, and get on the other line to Atlanta. So Joe's dad bought 2 tickets, a quart of homemade corn whiskey, and Joe said to Donald, "My dad began to give me medicine," until little Joe fell asleep. And he remembers nothing about the 172-mile train ride. But once in Atlanta, Joe's father found the brand new 1906 Grady Hospital, where they saved Joe's leg. They took off the kneecap and left him with a knee that could barely bend and a deep scar. When they got back home, Joe discovered he could not do hard physical work, farm work especially, and as he described it, "I became one of the girls." His mother taught him to knit, and he became the family sock knitter. He learned to spin flax. By the time he got to high school, he began to realize that he was going to have to find a way to make a living that didn't involve physical labor on a farm. He discovered that down in a place called Charlotte, there was a little school, King's Business College, that would teach you how to make a living doing office work. So he sold socks, he spun flax, and saved his money. And when he graduated from high school in 1918, he rode the train to Charlotte, found the school, and told them he wanted to enroll. They counted his money and told him he didn't have enough for 1 term, but he begged them to let him stay and learn as much as he could till the money ran out. Before the term was even over, they told him to go home. In less than 1 term, he had learned all the business, bookkeeping, typing, and shorthand they usually taught in 2 years. So he went home without a diploma, but with skills. And he was hired to be the first bank manager ever by 2 old men to run a wholesale grocery company. The next year, his father died, leaving him 5 younger brothers and a sister to raise, a widowed mother and an aunt to care for. And for the next 20 years, Joe raised the children, took care of his family, worked, saved his money, got to be 40 years old and realized he'd forgotten to do 2 things. He'd forgotten to get married, and he'd forgotten to spend money. When he was 41 years old, the man who had started the bank in town decided to sell it. And Joe bought into the deal. So when he met Donald's mother, he was 44 and she was 25, and he was Banker Joe. Donald's dad looked at him in the car and said, "Do you get it? If I hadn't got to be Cripple Joe, I would never have gotten to be Banker Joe. I'd be plowing fields." After that, Donald says it was okay if people called his father Banker Joe, but what he really liked was when people knew the story well enough to say, "Hello, Cripple Joe." That's the story that Joe heard once when he was 13. About 30 years later, when Donald started to do storytelling as a career, beginning to work with people on their stories, he was visiting his father, who by then was in his 80s. And he asked his dad, "How did you get to be able to tell your story the way you told me 30 years ago? Had you told it before?" And Banker Joe looked at him and said, "Oh, only about 200 times. When I came back from Atlanta, 5 years old with a crippled leg, Mama sat me down at the kitchen table and said, 'Joe, now it's time for you to tell the story.' And he told her he didn't want to tell the story because telling the story wouldn't change anything. He was crippled, and that was it. And his mom looked at Joe and said, 'You're not telling the story to change what happened. You're telling the story to change you.' And she made him tell it over and over and over again. And every time he told it, she gave him a different agenda. She said, 'Now, Joe, this time, tell the story and tell what you learned by living through that.' And then another time she'd say, 'Now, tell the story and tell what you think your daddy and I learned from living through that.' And eventually it was even, 'Tell the story and tell what you think the doctors in Atlanta learned from living through that.' And one day she said, 'Joe, if you don't tell this story enough, when you're 50 years old and you look at your leg, you'll be 5 years old again, and you'll be pitiful, because when something happens to you, it can sit on top of you like a rock. And if you never tell the story, it sits on you forever. But as you begin to tell the story, you climb out from under that rock, and eventually you sit up on top of it.' And then she said, 'Joe, tell the story and tell what you get to do now that your brothers don't get to do.' And he said, 'I told the story, and all of a sudden I was smiling because I realized I get to stay in the house and read while they worked on the farm.' He told the story again and again until he was about 15 years old, when he decided that chopping his leg was the best thing he'd ever done in life. The story doesn't change what happened, but the story has the remarkable power to completely change our whole relationship to what happened. And as Donald says, he learned more about what he does, helping other people discover the stories that are sitting on them and crawling out from under them, from listening to his grandmother coaching his dad on telling the story, than he ever learned in school, despite having 2 graduate degrees. So why am I telling you this? Because communication and how we tell stories has changed in our society, but the church, the followers of Jesus, have always told stories. It's all the Gospels are, stories about Jesus. And in a world of science and technique and mass consumption and easy answers, stories help us to ask and to stay with the deep questions of our lives. That's what stories can do, what art can do, what spirituality and faith community is all about. And that can be transformative for us, for one another, and for the world. So that's why I wanted to tell you that story. And now we're going to see where that story took you, just for a few minutes, because, and I'm almost done talking, in one of the most simple and revealing discussions that I ever had on the topic of a congregation's mission, and I know Trinity-St. Paul's has recently had such conversations, Bloor Street's in the midst of such conversations of congregational mission and vision. I remember the impact of a quiet voice that said, into the flow of words and aspirations and goals and objectives and all of that, said, in the end, whatever we say, it all comes down to changing lives, to transformation. Our own lives, the lives of others, the life of the world. Our challenge is to tell our story of what changing lives in the Spirit of God's presence and love has felt like, looked like, and what we've learned from that, and to keep telling that story, our story, in new ways going forward. I began this Ser-monologue with words from Krista Tippett about sharing our stories in the service of probing together who we are and who we want to be, that every great story opens into an equally galvanizing exchange we can have together. But so what? How does this change anything? If transformed lives is kind of what we're all about, can we push ourselves further and use words more powerfully and learn how to tell and remake our story, our stories anew? When I first heard Donald Davis's TED Talk, which is where that story comes from, I immediately found stories bubbling up within me. And I thought that might be true of you this morning. Friends, the world now is too dangerous and too beautiful for anything but love. May your eyes be so blessed that you see God in everyone, your ears so you hear the cry of the poor. May your hands be so blessed that everything you touch is a sacrament, your lips so you speak nothing but the truth with love. And may your feet be so blessed you run to those who need you. And may your hearts be so opened, so set on fire that your love changes everything. Go in peace. Amen.